Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog, and today I'm going to show you how to do the Finchley Graft. This is a clever alternative to the Kitchener stitch. Although it creates basically the same end result, it's a whole lot easier to remember how to do it. I'm using the Finchley Graft to close up the bottom of my little bird's phone pocket. But this method would also work well for top-down socks, bottom-up mittens, or almost anywhere you would otherwise use the Kitchener stitch to join two rows of knitting. Let's get started. To begin, the stitches that you're going to be grafting it together should be divided evenly onto two needles, and your yarn tail needs to be 5 to 6 times longer than the length that you'll be joining. And I generally like to err on the side of having my yarn tail a little bit too long rather than too short, because I don't want to risk running out of yarn as I'm grafting things together. For the Kitchener stitch, we work with the right side or the knit side of the fabric facing us. However, with the Finchley Graft, we're going to work from the purl side or the wrong side. So I'm going to turn my knitting here inside out by bringing my knitting up through this center opening. Now that things are turned inside out, I'm going to go ahead and thread my tail onto a yarn needle, and we can start grafting. We're going to be grafting our stitches from right to left, and we don't really need to remember whether we're pulling our yarn through the stitches knitwise or purl-wise. Instead, we're going to think of it a little bit differently. We're always going to be pulling our yarn tail through the center of each stitch. That's the first stitch on each needle. So I'm going to slide my stitches here down to the knitting needle tips. Right now, my yarn tail is at the front, so I want to pull it through from this side. It's onto the opposite side, so from the front to the back, and I'm going to go through the center of the first stitch on each needle. And what I mean by that is I'm going to take my yarn needle and I'm going to go through the center of the first stitch without twisting it, and then again through the center of the first stitch on that back needle without twisting it. Pull the yarn through and just make sure that that yarn tail stays underneath your two knitting needles so things don't get tangled up and wrapped around. Once the yarn tail is through, you can go ahead and drop that second stitch off the needle. Now, my yarn tail is at the back of my work. I need to pull it through to the opposite side, so from the back to the front, going through the center of the first stitch on each needle. So I'm going to go through the center of the first stitch on the back, and then through the center of the first stitch on the front, and pull the yarn through, and then drop that second stitch that I pulled through off the front needle. So let's see it again. My yarn tail is at the front, so I'm going to pull it through from the front to the back, going through the center of the first stitch on each needle. So going through the center of the stitch on the front needle, through the center of the stitch on the back needle, pull the yarn through, and drop it off that second needle. Now my working yarn is at the back, so I'm going to pull it from the back to the front through the center of the first stitch on each needle. So I'm going to go through the center of the stitch on the back, through the center of the stitch on the front, pull the yarn through, and drop it off my front needle. Just like the Kitchener stitch, it's better if your grafting is a little bit too loose rather than too tight. If it's too loose, you can tighten it up later when you're done grafting and turn things right side out. If it's too tight, it's a little bit harder to loosen things up than to tighten them. So let's talk for just a minute about reading your work. First of all, if you don't remember which direction you're supposed to go next, look where your yarn tail is. If your yarn tail is at the front, you need to pull it through from the front to the back to the opposite side. If your yarn tail would happen to be at the back, then you'd pull it from the back to the front. So my yarn tail's at the front. I'm going to pull it right through the center of the stitch from the front through to the back. And now, how do you tell if you remembered to drop the stitch off the needle after you pulled your yarn through? I'm looking now, my yarn tail is at the back, so I know that I need to pull the yarn from the back to the front. If I pulled it through the stitch that's on my needle now, it's just going to come right out. My grafting is going to come undone because you can see, and I'm going to lift it here a little bit, this strand here, if I pulled through my needle from the back to the front right now, it would just undo this strand that I've already worked. That means that I forgot, when I pulled my yarn through last time, I forgot to drop this stitch off my needle. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And again, my yarn tail's at the back, so I need to pull it through from the back to the front, going through the center of each stitch. Pull the yarn through and then drop it off. So I'm going to continue grafting all the way across until I get to these last few stitches, and then I'll show you what happens. I'm down to my last couple of stitches here, so I'm going to go ahead and finish up my graft. And then once we get to that last pair of stitches, we're going to bring the yarn through both stitches from the front to the back. And I'm just going to drop both stitches off the knitting needles. So now that the join is complete, we can leave our yarn tail there on the wrong side, and let's turn things right side out. And it looks like I may have gotten things a little bit too tight. I didn't take my own advice, but for the bottom of the pouch, that's okay. Overall though, you can still see that just like with the Kitchener stitch, the Finchley Graft makes your stitches join up here so they're aligned in nice columns. If when you turned things right side out, if you noticed that the join was really loose here and that you had lots of large stitches, you would start from the beginning of your join and work across, and leg by leg just tighten things up until you got to the end of the join. Once you got your tension right, you can just go ahead and turn things inside out again so that you can weave in your yarn tails. So I hope you enjoyed learning how to do the Finchley Graft. If you did enjoy this technique, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. And if you'd like to try this in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechilidog.com and look for my Little Bird's Phone Pocket. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!